You ever think about how everything's connected? Like, in these really strange and sometimes kind of bizarre ways? While some of those connections can be fun and exciting, others, man, others can leave a lasting, dark impact on people's lives. Something that's happening to you right now could be the exact same thing that someone you've never even met has already been through. Some people might just call that a coincidence. Others might call it a crazy experience. And some might actually find a little bit of comfort in it, just knowing they're not alone in what they're feeling. The case we're getting into today is a perfect example of just that. When 27-year-old Tracy Ocasio went missing after a game night at a place called the Florida Taproom Bar back in 2009, her parents and the police they tore the place apart looking for her. Sadly, they didn't find Tracy. But what they did uncover was a whole chain of just awful things that had happened to other people. And what did all these things have in common? Well, it was a person. And that person was not only behind a handful of violent attacks, but he could very well be the reason for Tracy's disappearance. How? Well, he was the last person to be seen with Tracy. The heartbreaking case of Tracy Ocasio has been open for the last 15 years, but that doesn't mean the case hasn't been solved, at least not in the minds of many. I mean, we know what happened to her and who did it, but what is so devastating is that Tracy herself has never been found. Not her body, not her remains, nothing. But here's the thing. This case is unlike any other missing person case, because while in most scenarios the killer is the one who's still out there, in Tracy's case, the monster who did this is already behind bars. And it's Tracy who the detectives are still searching for. Before we get into today's case, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? What time is it? And what's the weather like over there? Also, what case should I do next? Let me know down below. I read all of them. And hit that subscribe button. Let's begin. Tracy Aileen Ocasio was born in 1982 to her parents Elizabeth, who went by Liz and Joseph Ocasio, in Ocoee, Florida. Growing up, Tracy was a total daddy's girl. She had these big dreams of going to college to study radiology, and she loved animals of all kinds. I mean, Tracy had pet lizards, scorpions, and even a cat named Cookie. Tracy also loved to read. She was super into history and literature, and she would just devour books about World War II and ancient Rome. Another one of Tracy's interests was making handmade jewelry, which was one of her favorite things to do in her spare time. Tracy and her parents, they shared a really close bond. Whenever Tracy was out and about, a day would not go by without her calling her mom, just filling her in on her everyday routine and what she was up to. After she graduated from high school, Tracy took a job as a waitress at a local restaurant, and she was taking some online college courses. At one point, Tracy did move out of the family home because she'd just gotten engaged. But sadly, that whole happily ever after thing, it was cut short when they broke off the engagement and soon broke up for good. It's unclear why it even happened, but this led to Tracy moving back in with her parents. But they didn't mind that at all. One thing that Tracy and her dad, Joseph, really shared was a love for sports, basketball in particular. Tracy and Joseph's favorite team was the local Orlando Magic, and there wasn't a single game that Tracy would skip for anything in the world. By all accounts, Tracy was a normal 27-year-old girl who had big dreams and was well on her way to achieving them. She loved her family, and things were going pretty well for her. But one day, in May of 2009, bam. Without any warning, Tracy just disappeared. May 26th of 2009 was supposed to be a fun day for Tracy. There was a huge basketball game between the Orlando Magic and the Cleveland Cavaliers, and Tracy had this ritual of watching every single Magic game, either with her friends or with her dad. On that particular day, Tracy had plans to watch it with her dad, but he had a last-minute work errand he had to run, so he didn't end up sticking around. So Tracy then went to the Florida Taproom Bar, which is on Raleigh Street, by herself, and she enjoyed the game there. Now, this bar was packed with basketball lovers, so it wasn't like it was a scary situation for her. Besides, this was a place she went to all the time, so she knew a lot of people there. It was basically her second home, especially during basketball season. Well, fast forward to the end of the game. Tracy was supposed to come home, but hours started to go by, and there was no sign of her. Her mom, Liz, was getting even more worried since she didn't get her routine text from Tracy that day. Also, Tracy had no post-game plans. According to the last conversation that Liz had with Tracy, she was going to come straight home after the game was over. But hours later, Tracy still wasn't there, and all of the calls to her phone just went straight to voicemail. Immediately, 27-year-old Tracy Ocasio was reported missing, and a search for her kicked off. The detectives decided to look into the last place where Tracy was seen, and that was the bar on Raleigh Street. Luckily, they got their hands on the surveillance footage, and they even saw Tracy. But she wasn't alone. The footage showed Tracy leaving the bar with a man at around 1 to 1:30 in the morning. And when the investigators showed this footage to Tracy's parents, they didn't recognize this mystery guy at all. So, the cops were able to identify Tracy in that footage from the clothes she was wearing: black jeans, a tank top, a hoodie, and this green and white hat. The man with her was bald, looked like he was around her age, and honestly, he and Tracy seemed close. They were talking, looked like they were having a good time, and they left together shortly after. There wasn't anything in the footage that screamed danger. It looked like Tracy was coherent, like she was willingly leaving with this mystery guy. So the detectives, they have a lead, but now they gotta figure out who this man is. And while the officers are on that very task, they get a call. Tracy's car has been found. She had driven it to the Florida Taproom Bar. It was a yellow 2002 two-door Chevrolet Cobalt. And it was found in a parking lot on Franklin Street in Ocoee on May 27th at about 7 p.m. But get this, the car was unlocked, and it just looked dumped, abandoned. Inside, there were no belongings, and the only thing that really stood out to the police was the fact that the front seats were pushed all the way forward, which kind of makes you think someone was trying to shove something into the back seat, or pull something, or someone out. This was not usual behavior for Tracy. Now, I'm not sure why the police thought this was so odd, other than the fact that it was a Chevy Cobalt. I mean, trying to fit an adult into the back seat of a two-door version of this car would be damn near impossible. And if Tracy had stuff with her, she almost certainly would have put it in the trunk, not the back seat. But all that aside, the car was found deserted in this really dark part of the street. Literally no streetlights, nothing. And according to her dad, Joseph, Tracy would never ever go there if she had any other choice. She was afraid of the dark, so why the hell was her car there? Well, the answer to that question came pretty quickly. Remember the man Tracy was seen with on the night she disappeared? He was finally identified. His name was James Hathaway, and he was the only one who could possibly know what had happened to Tracy. When the detectives get in touch with him, he's very cooperative, giving them information. According to James, he'd met Tracy at the Florida Taproom Bar, and they had talked for a bit. After the game, he'd asked Tracy for a ride home, since he didn't have a car, and she did. And according to James, Tracy just dropped him off and went on her way. And that was that. Okay, but interestingly, the place where Tracy's car was found was just 150 yards away from James's house, where he lived with his dad. So, not only was James the last person to see Tracy, but now she's missing, and her car is found just a stone's throw from his home. The investigators were definitely suspicious, but there was no hard evidence to tie James to her disappearance, so they had to let him go. The next thing the detectives had to go through was Tracy's phone activity. It turned out her phone was turned off on May 27th at around 8:30 in the morning. And the last location where her phone pinged? The same exact place where her car was found. Luckily, on those grounds, the investigators were able to get a search warrant for James's home. And inside, they didn't find Tracy or any clue about where she was, but they did find lots and lots of drugs. Not only that, the investigators also found out that James was abusing drugs while he was out on bond. So even though he didn't appear to have anything to do with Tracy's disappearance at that moment, he was arrested for those charges. But if that wasn't bad enough, upon his arrest, detectives realized that James also had a whole laundry list of crimes behind his name, including a juvenile kidnapping charge. Jesus Christ. After James's arrest, two witnesses who also happened to be James's friends came forward. They said they saw a woman matching Tracy's description leaving the bar with James. The second witness said that Tracy, after pulling up to James's house, actually went inside and hung out for a bit. James, at one point, even tried to convince her to do drugs, but she refused, and that was when she left. And that's when the detectives knew. James had lied to them when he claimed she'd simply dropped him off. He was spinning tales, and there was definitely something fishy going on. Luckily, he was now in police custody, and he wasn't going anywhere. While James was in custody, the detectives used every available resource to try and track down Tracy. They searched with bloodhounds, cadaver dogs, but strangely, they didn't even pick up her scent in her own car. In the meantime, Tracy's dad, Joseph, was going around putting up flyers everywhere, and he combed through every single area where Tracy was recently seen. The investigation started slowing down after a couple of weeks, and that was when Joseph called Texas EquuSearch founder Tim Miller for assistance in finding Tracy. Soon after, volunteers scoured 2,500 acres of land, but Tracy still couldn't be found. All the while, the detectives were interrogating James, who was under arrest for those other charges, but he was certainly a person of interest in Tracy's disappearance at this point. So all that said, who was this James Hathaway guy? Well, James was a troubled kid growing up. He had a juvenile criminal record, and he was also abusing drugs from a very young age. He worked random jobs for the most part and would help his father out, dredging ponds and dumping land debris in illegal dumping grounds without getting caught. And at the time of Tracy's disappearance, James was actually out on bond, which in hindsight is very, very alarming. Tracy's parents held public searches and interviews. They were trying everything they could to get any information about their daughter. At that point, it had been almost a month since Tracy disappeared, and the Ocasio family was just worried sick. There were a lot of tips that came in, but they would all hit a dead end at some point, even though some of them sounded very believable. At the same time, James was getting tried in court for his other charges, and this led to a whole new revelation of his actions. The police were even more suspicious of him now, and he eventually became the prime suspect in Tracy's disappearance. See, once James was the main suspect in Tracy's disappearance publicly, that was when a lot of people came forward with their own unpleasant experiences with him. According to the police, James's story just kept changing. He was lying about Tracy leaving right after the ride. He had no alibi, and he even tried to pin her disappearance on a work friend at one point. So, people who actually knew James started coming forward, and they said that he was known to be violent towards women. That he could just flip a switch, go from happy and charming to downright deadly in a fraction of a second. And the most concerning piece of information was James's involvement in a woman's attempted murder that took place almost a year before Tracy even disappeared. And get this. This woman's name was Rachel Clark, and the way she and James met, man, the pattern is just chillingly similar. James had asked Rachel for a ride home, and after the ride, he hugged her goodbye, and that's when he just snapped. He grabbed Rachel, pinned her to the ground, and started violently attacking her, telling her, "Don't make me kill you." Rachel was trapped underneath this man who was clearly trying to finish her off for good. She was screaming for help. And thank God, a passerby intervened and yelled at James, who then just ran away, leaving Rachel injured on the sidewalk. Her neck was badly bruised, she had injuries and scratches all over her face and arms, but luckily, she was still alive. And what's so infuriating about this part is that James wasn't even charged for this attack. Seriously, even though Rachel filed a report, the detectives just couldn't find him. At least not until a year later when James was named as the main suspect in Tracy's case. Now, the investigators had to look into Rachel's case too, because they wanted to keep James behind bars so that he couldn't get away. Because at this point, they were confident he was also responsible for Tracy's disappearance. In the meantime, the search for Tracy was still on. And during one of the searches on a lake, something else emerged, and it was just as horrifying. See, On February 22nd, 2011, almost 2 full years into Tracy's disappearance, the detectives were searching a nearly dried-up lake called Lake Carter. And as soon as they searched the area, they found a human spinal bone and a skull. Jesus Christ. As the lake was drained even further, more bones were recovered. On February 24th, they also found a wallet, an ID, and a cell phone nearby. And the name on the ID was Onda Christopher George. The police were just confused. They were all out there trying to find any sign of Tracy, and now they'd come across Onda's remains. But who was he? Well, even though Onda and Tracy were strangers, there was one person who knew, or at least interacted with, both of them. And that was none other than James Hathaway. When the remains found at the dried-up lake were tested with Onda's DNA, the results were a positive match. Onda was now confirmed to be gone. But the detectives would soon figure out the link between him and James. See, during the investigation into James, a lot of leads were coming in. Someone had also anonymously contacted Tracy's dad, Joseph, and said that he knew of a woman who was an accomplice of James, and that according to her, he was behind 3 other homicides in the Orlando area. According to the tip, the victims' bodies and the murder weapons were all thrown into various lakes. This was the main reason why investigators were searching the lakes to begin with. And even though the lead could have been a hoax, given James's history of criminal violence, the detectives weren't about to let it go that easily. They wanted to make sure this tip was legit, and it turns out that it was. According to witness reports, Onda was last seen with James and another person in early February of 2009. So this was before Tracy's disappearance, but after the attack on Rachel, Onda lived in a place called Apopka, and he was reported missing on February 11th. The series of events goes like this. James and another person are seen coming out of a wooded area. That was when a police officer was on patrol, and he saw the 2 men. When he asked them what they were doing, James told the officer that his friend, Chris, was high on drugs and that the 2 of them were just helping him out. The officer decided to let them go and didn't check up on whoever this Chris was. And later, Onda George's car was found abandoned at Lake Carter. If you remember, this was the exact same place where his remains and his belongings were found. Oh man. When Onda's remains were ID'd, his parents were contacted, and the Ocasio family and the George family, in this really dark, tragic way, they bonded over their mutual loss. They were heartbroken for each other, and they just wanted the person responsible for what happened to their loved ones to pay. Now, Onda's remains were also taken for an autopsy to determine a cause of death, but because of how decomposed they were, the results came back inconclusive. So, whether Onda passed away from a drug overdose, if you can even take James's word for it, or if something else happened to him, the truth is, we just don't know. But it was still damn strange that James was right there at that time. But since there's no hard evidence to pin Onda's demise on James, he can't be found guilty for this. With the evidence the detectives did have, though, they knew that James, who was currently being held at Seminole County Jail, could absolutely be tried for Rachel's attempted murder. And this was exactly what happened. In May of 2011, the trial for Rachel's attempted murder was held. And the star testimony, of course, was from the victim herself. Rachel bravely took the stand and described in detail how James just violently attacked her on the night that she met him. James was present for all of this, and he just sat there with this stoic, stone-cold expression on his face, watching everything that went on in the courtroom. As for James's defense, it was built on the idea that he was just incoherent and drunk, and wasn't aware of what he was doing, that he had no idea how he got his own injuries. I mean, come on. Rachel's injuries were also shown in court, and the jurors were just horrified to see her battered face. It clearly didn't look like an accident or a moment of some drunken haze. The jury deliberated, and the verdict was out. James Hathaway was held guilty of attempted murder, as well as burglary, robbery, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to life in prison. And everyone in that courtroom could finally let out the breath that they'd been holding for so long. Now, at last, this violent man was finally behind bars. And get this, after the sentencing, James took the stand and apologized to Rachel. He said something to the effect of, her injuries were his fault and he was sorry for what happened. But then he added that he knew he did not try to kill her. Just the nerve. To think that James first tried to attack Rachel completely out of the blue, with clear intentions to end her life, and was now giving this pathetic non-apology, as if that could somehow magically erase all of the hurt and trauma and fear from her memory. It's just so appalling. In the end, investigators were ultimately forced to admit that at this point, getting Tracy's case solved, well, it likely wasn't going to happen. There just wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone with anything, even though they knew good and well who was behind her disappearance. After the sentencing, the Ocasio family also gave a statement. Tracy's dad, Joseph, spoke about their ordeal. Rachel also gave a statement at the sentencing, where she said it's just so heartbreaking that because of one man, 3 different families were affected and brought together to finally make him face the consequences of his senseless actions. But crazy enough, in February of 2015, James appealed the decision. He asked for a new hearing because he apparently felt he was pressured by his lawyers to waive his rights to a speedy trial. It was granted, but the outcome was pretty much the same. James Hathaway is still going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the story's not quite over yet. Even though Rachel got the closure she needed, and she knew that James was never going to attack her or any other person again, the Ocasio family, as well as the George family, they are still in the middle of it all. James is still the prime suspect in Tracy's disappearance, or worse, her death, but there just isn't enough evidence for the state to prove that. I can't imagine what Tracy's family must be going through. It's been 15 years since Tracy was last seen at a place she frequented, and now, no one knows where she is. She hasn't contacted anyone in the last decade and a half, and no one has found any other clues about her. Joseph and Liz are still fighting to bring Tracy's case to an end so that they can try to move on and accept that she is gone for good. But until that day comes, they live with this uncertainty, this fear, and this hope, all mingled together in a very strange way in their hearts. And Joseph. Oh man, this part just breaks your heart. To this day, he feels guilty about letting Tracy go to the bar on her own. He still believes that if he had been with her, Tracy would have been safe. It's just so devastating to see a father go through this, regardless of whether or not that statement may actually have proven true. This wasn't his fault, not in any way. If anyone is responsible for whatever happened to Tracy, then it's most likely James. Although the state hasn't found any rock-solid evidence of his involvement in her disappearance to this day. We can only hope that Tracy's family finds some sort of peace and closure. Because even though Tracy's case is 15 years old, it is still open, and a detective named David Gray still checks up on any leads that come his way. Tracy's parents deserve to know what happened to their daughter. No one should have to go through this. Missing person cases are so hard for so many reasons, and it's one thing to not know who did what. But it's a whole other roller coaster ride of emotions, a whole other kind of hell when the victim's family doesn't even know where their loved one is, even though the potential perpetrator is already behind bars. So much can change within minutes, and no one really knows when tragedy will strike. And oftentimes, that's the hardest pill to swallow. So in the end, that's where the story just hangs. James Hathaway is locked away for life, justice served for the brutal attack on Rachel Clark. But for the family of Onda George, and especially for the family of Tracy Ocasio, it's a hollow victory. They're left in this unbearable limbo, knowing who is almost certainly responsible for their loss, but with no body, no official charges, and no final answers. It's a special kind of hell. When you try to make sense of this, to figure out the key factor that led to this tragedy, it really boils down to 2 things. First, and most infuriatingly, is a complete and total systemic failure. Let's be real. James Hathaway should have been in jail a year before he ever crossed paths with Tracy Ocasio. Rachel Clark did everything right. She survived a violent attack, she went to the police, she filed a report, and the system just dropped the ball. They couldn't find him. And because of that failure, a violent predator was left free to hunt again. There is no doubt in my mind that if he had been held accountable for what he did to Rachel, Tracy Ocasio would still be alive today. The second factor is just the chilling reality of how predators operate. Tracy was a kind person. She was doing something nice for a guy who asked for a ride home. She was in a familiar place, surrounded by people. She wasn't doing anything risky, and her kindness was used as a weapon against her. James Hathaway represents that terrifying reality. The monster who doesn't look like a monster. The one who exploits a normal human moment of trust to set a trap. The moral of this story is a tough one to swallow. It's about the devastating consequences that ripple out when the system fails to do its job. It's about the horrifying randomness of violence. But it's also about the incredible, unending strength of a family's love. For 15 years, the Ocasio family has not stopped fighting for their daughter. They refuse to let her become just another cold case file. So, how can you possibly protect yourself from something like this? There's no foolproof plan, but there are things to keep in mind. First and foremost, the buddy system is a classic for a reason. Tracy only went to that bar alone because of a last-minute change of plans with her dad. Going out with friends and leaving with those same friends adds a powerful layer of safety. And you have to trust your gut. Always. The footage didn't show anything obviously wrong, but if you're in a situation with someone new and something just feels off, you don't need a logical reason to leave. Just get out of there. Make an excuse, call a friend to come get you, do whatever you have to do. Your intuition is your best defense. Even in seemingly innocent situations, like giving someone a ride, it's okay to maintain your boundaries. You don't have to let them all the way to your door. You can drop them at a well-lit intersection. It's not about being rude, it's about being safe. And for all of us, the bigger lesson is to demand more from our communities and our systems. When someone, especially a woman, reports a violent attack, it needs to be taken seriously, every single time. Follow-up is critical. Holding dangerous people accountable isn't just about justice for the past victim, it's about preventing future ones. If you or someone you know has been a victim of any crime, please know that you are not alone, and there are resources available to help you navigate the aftermath. You can contact the National Center for Victims of Crime Helpline. Their number is 1-8554-VICTIM. That's 1-855-484-2846. They provide confidential support, information, and resources for victims of all types of crime in the United States. In the end, this story is about Tracy, a 27-year-old girl who loved the Orlando Magic, who was a total daddy's girl, who had pet scorpions and loved reading about ancient Rome. She had a full, vibrant life ahead of her, a dream of working in medicine, a family that adored her, and it was all stolen in an instant. Her father's guilt is heartbreaking, but it is so misplaced. The blame here lies with a violent man, and with a system that failed to stop him when it had the chance. And until the day they find her, Tracy Ocasio's family will continue to live with that special kind of pain. The pain of knowing who, but never knowing why or where. And that is a tragedy beyond measure.